Oh, thanks, John, for inviting us, and we're thankful for the opportunity to come and speak to you all today. Definitely is a positive step if you ever have to deal with a disaster or recovery from a disaster. Has anyone here ever been associated with a disaster here at the university or anywhere else? Great. Anyone here familiar with FEMA and how we operate? Well, good, you can have my job because I don't know. I mean, you can definitely run with it in that respect. No, really, we're really glad to be here, and as you see in some of my follow-on slides, we'll kind of give you the synopsis on why it's so important to have gatherings like this to hopefully spread the wealth and spread the information flow, so if a disaster should occur, you're better prepared for it, and we're better prepared to help serve you as one of our customers. As John mentioned, I'm Mike Scott. I'm a Federal Coordinating Officer. I'm assigned to Region 7, which is located in Kansas City. Anyone here know what a Federal Coordinating Officer, an FCO, is? Okay. An FCO is actually the senior federal official appointed by the President whenever a disaster declares in a specific region or state. The President declares a disaster. When he or she declares a disaster, an FCO is deployed to that location and oversees that disaster operation with a state counterpart to ensure that all the needs are met. With me today, I also have Joe Hillman, and Joe's right over here. Joe's also from Region 7. He's a public assistance specialist, so if you've got those, especially any public works folks here, okay, public works, you got those really technical questions, he's my answer key there, so he can definitely help us out in that respect. Joe and I actually, we're assigned to Region 7. We can go anywhere there's a disaster. However, Kansas is our state of specialty, if you want to call it that. Whenever a disaster happens within the state of Kansas, normally he and I will be assigned to that particular disaster. The only other reason we may not be is just because we have a surge of operations within our region, which we are currently experiencing with Joplin, the Missouri River, and you name it. We're having a lot of issues right now that we're having to respond to. But we would normally be assigned here in the state of Kansas. Matter of fact, for about the last 2 years, we had 6 disasters, presidential disasters we oversaw here in Kansas, based either out of Topeka or Wichita. So many of you probably weren't even aware of that, other than probably the winter snowstorm that happened about a year ago, because I think you were one of the declared counties in that respective disaster. So we'll talk a little bit about that. That's kind of where we come from. If there's any questions at all, again, I'd like to keep this very informal. Please chime in and ask. Being part of the federal government, we know acronyms and all that kind of stuff, kind of one of these things. So, if we say something or do something, let us know, because we definitely want to get the information flow in the right direction to give you everything that you need. We're primarily going to talk about the public assistance program, and I'm going to tailor it to the university environment. I'm going to talk a little bit about how a presidential declaration comes about, and with the presidential declaration, what are your entitlements? What are you eligible for? And I'll talk a little bit about the demographics of our organization and how we respond to a disaster situation. Here's our mission. When our administrator, Administrator Fugate, came on board, he wanted to make sure that everyone understood, and he still pounds this message wherever he goes, is FEMA is not the team. We are part of the team. Whenever we come to a disaster, we are primarily a supporting player in that role. For example, when we come to the state of Kansas, we're here to support the state, and the state has to request us to be there. Along with that, you as part of the university environment, being a public entity, you're one of our team players too. We believe in that whole community support, because how many of you here have a disaster preparedness plan at home right now? Okay, if you don't, you probably should. Just basic fire. Where's the family going to meet? Where are you going to go to? You got somebody with maybe some challenges. How are they going to get out of the house? You have a pet. Who's going to be responsible for the pet? Those type of things. If you haven't thought about it, you need to think about it. And that's part of that whole community that not only helps yourself, helps the first responders when they come to your house. When you have that plan in place and can tell them where you're located, it saves a first responder from going in unnecessarily into your house. Or, for example, in some of the instances that we have with tornadoes or hurricanes, it may be 48 to 72 hours before you get any type of support based on the location and the commodities that we need to bring on hand. So you need to be prepared. So with this mission statement, our administrator pretty much came on board and said, we need to be a team. all across the board, from the citizen all the way up to our organization, and we can't stress that enough. We really need your help, and that's great that we have this forum here today, because we can share that information and hopefully make you better prepared to respond to, recover, and mitigate any type of disaster that may come your way. FEMA is divided up into 10 geographic regions. It is the regional offices in each of these areas that is ultimately responsible for the recovery and response of that particular area. Here for Kansas is located in Kansas City. We are Region 7, and we are responsible for Nebraska, Iowa, Missouri, and Kansas. And currently, we will have a disaster declaration in every one of those states except Kansas, but that may be forthcoming, because right now Joe is actually leading some preliminary damage assessment teams, everything from the tornado that I think hit Reading to current flooding that's going on up north. So we're doing assessments right now, so the process is ongoing. We may have a disaster here in Kansas shortly. But this gives you an idea. The regions are the tip of the spear. You know, I mean that more for informational. The regions are the tip of the spear. They're the ones out there providing the support that you all need in a disaster environment. The FEMA workforce. A lot of folks aren't familiar with this, but you know, we only have 4,700 full-time workers in FEMA. Joe and I are both full-time workers. We rely on what we call our disaster assistance force, or reservists. We have about 12,000. And I kind of throw that out as a recruiting plug for any of you that might be in those retirement years, getting close to retiring from the university environment. Most of our folks that are part of our disaster assistance cadre are retired from either law enforcement, the military, education, construction trade, insurance, educators, you name it. The demographics for our disaster assistance force is more on the mature end, if you get my drift. And the reason behind that is we pay a great wage and salary to these folks, but they get no benefits. And they're on call. Some of these folks may work as little as 30 days a year. Some may work the whole year continuously. You make yourself available. And if you're interested in something like that, see Joe or I. You can actually register through, go to FEMA.gov and put disaster assistance employee in the search, and it'll tell you how to go about that process. Our disaster assistance employees, they're everything from the public works type individuals to attorneys to educators. We have training officers that come out and train us. We have safety, security, logistics. We have the whole gamut. We're pretty much like a miniature city when we come to set up a disaster field operation, that we rely quite heavily on our disaster assistance employees. So, like I said, whenever we show up for a disaster, we set up what we call a JFO. That's a joint field office. And that joint field office, we could have as few as 70 to 100 employees working out of that office. Or if you get a large hurricane, or for example in Joplin right now in Missouri, I think we have 600 folks working in conjunction with that field office there. When it comes to like a Katrina or something like that, we may have 3,000 folks mobilized to help support that disaster operation. So it's all on the complexity and scope of the disaster at hand. But as you can see, we only have 4,700 full-time employees. All of our regional folks that are in the region office, I would say 99.5% of the members there are all permanent full-time. We do have some reservists that come in and help augment us at times. But primarily when you go out in the field and we have a joint field office, I would say in the disasters that Joe and I had here in Kansas, we had a staff of about 100. Out of that 100, maybe 3 or 4 were permanent full-time workers, and the rest were our disaster reservists working the field. When do we respond? The key point here is the governor must request for our presence. We just don't arbitrarily show up. We may posture, we may surge and have everything ready. For example, we know hurricane season is coming. We may set up staging bases with everything from water to cots to, you name the commodity. We'll be ready to go, but we do not enter that state until the governor requests. And then even with that request, from a financial standpoint and from a standpoint as far as when I can expend funds to help assist the citizens of that state, we have to have a presidential declaration. The president has to declare it to be a disaster area before we go in there. And how do we get a presidential disaster declaration? The state will normally ask for what we call a PDA, or a preliminary damage assessment team. That's what Joe is working on right now. A preliminary damage assessment team is a joint team comprised of state, local, and federal folks, And they go out and pretty much canvass the entire incident area. And with that, they have a set of criteria they look at, and we'll talk about that here later. But they determine whether there's enough damages or injuries or fatalities that it warrants a presidential declaration. And we'll talk a little bit more about what warrants a presidential declaration. The bottom line, the president has to sign for us to expend funds. And for you here in the university environment, that's grants. You know, if you get a public assistance disaster declared and say a tornado comes through here, in order to rebuild or repair and pay for it, we have to have that presidential declaration to help fund that. And a lot of folks just assume by FEMA it's got to be a tornado, it's got to be a hurricane or whatever. We don't differentiate between man-made or a natural disaster. It could be a terrorist attack, heaven forbid. If something were to happen in that realm, we would respond. And again, the president can declare a disaster based on the situation at hand. So it doesn't have to be a natural disaster to fall within a presidential disaster declaration. Here's what we provide. Essentially, we can provide aid to individuals, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. When we applied aid to individuals, that's the homeowner that's out there. That's called individual assistance. You're seeing a lot of that in Joplin. Right now, we're providing temporary housing units, grief counseling, mortuary affairs, those type of things. We can provide that when it's in the individual realm. Most of the disasters that we support here within Region 7, though, are primarily the public assistance type disasters. That's you all. You're an eligible applicant if your county would be declared. And we primarily spend, I would say, Joe, for our region, probably, I don't know, 70% public assistance probably, or maybe even higher. Yeah, something like that. Yeah. And we also promote risk reduction. We're going to talk a little bit about here. When we have a public assistance disaster, we try to mitigate future disasters, and we will provide funds for that mitigation. Along with that, we have a hazard mitigation grant program that that you'll see will normally be declared with a presidential disaster declaration, and I'll talk more about that specifically too. But the big thing is we're going to help defray state and local costs of handling the emergency. Everything from the administrative side, that being bringing on workers to respond to that disaster, to the actual buildup of facilities, infrastructure, that type of thing. Types of disasters. There's two types of disasters the president can declare. He can declare an emergency declaration, and essentially there's a cap to that, up to $5 million. And with that is primarily the essential emergency services. The state of Nebraska right now has an emergency declaration that was approved by the president. And what that entails is, in regards to the flooding, providing the Coast Guard with the rubber dinghies and boats to go out and rescue folks, protective measures in the way of sandbags, berms, levee reconstruction, those are beef up, those type of things. Anything to save the life and sustain the current conditions, that will fall under emergency services, and that's the emergency declaration. And that's one end. When you have a major presidential disaster declaration, you have essentially two types, an individual assistance and public assistance. And I touched on that earlier. The individual assistance is exactly what it says. It's for individuals. It's for the normal citizen out there that might have had their home damaged, lost their vehicle, all those type of things. We will provide individual assistance if it's declared. And then public assistance, as I mentioned earlier, that's for those public entities and certain nonprofits that are out there, and these are specifically stated in the presidential declaration on what type of disaster we're responding to. Hazard mitigation, as I referred to earlier, no matter if you get an individual assistance or public assistance, hazard mitigation is usually defined within that presidential declaration for the entire state. And what do I mean by that? Say, for example, Douglas County is declared as one of the counties in a disaster, but say nearby Sedgwick County is not. Sedgwick would still be eligible for hazard mitigation because they say it's statewide. An example of hazard mitigation is a tornado shelter. For example, a certain amount of funds are put aside to help aid the rest of the state in case they have a disaster of some sort, and the percentage of the money comes from that total pot of whatever that disaster declaration is determined to be at the end. And the state actually runs the hazard mitigation program. You have to, if you're interested in a hazard mitigation grant, like for example for a safe shelter or something of that nature, you apply through the state and the state determines the rank and priority of how that works out. Yeah. Okay, that's a great example. And that all comes from the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. Whenever a presidential disaster is declared, a certain portion of that money is set aside for that type of program. Great, that's good use of it. This is a snapshot of a true picture of all the disasters we have in the U.S. right now. These are all the presidential disasters that have been declared. Right now we have 24 major field offices supporting 34 presidential declarations and 7 emergency declarations. You can see here in Region 7, the entire state of Missouri, every county has a presidential disaster against it. I'm actually supporting some tornadoes that hit Iowa back about 2 months ago, and there's 6 counties up there, and then all of Nebraska here is an emergency declaration associated with flooding. And Kansas is right behind here, and you may see some of that light up here in the next month or so. But that gives you an idea. We're quite busy. There's quite a bit of activity going on, and June 1st is the start of hurricane season, and we haven't even ventured in that direction yet. So it kind of gives you a flavor of the entire country. Here's Region 7 specific disasters. This is a snapshot look within the last, since 2006. There have been 64 declarations in Region 7. And you can see some of the high, I'm sure everyone's familiar with the Greensburg tornado, you can see, and the 2008 flooding in Iowa. You can kind of get a feel for what our region has to deal with here. And for Kansas itself, in the same time period, we've delivered over $1 billion in federal grants to disaster assistance. And if you look at the total obligations for the Region 7 is over $5.6 billion for this same time period. So we definitely have been out there in the field, and a lot of folks, and I have to give the state of Kansas credit. The state of Kansas has a very strong emergency management team. They have a strong public assistance team that whenever you all are out in the field, you're very fortunate because not all states have that, and you've got some good folks that will help you see you through the process. So I have to give Kansas a lot of credit for that. Our primary risk, as you can imagine, throughout Region 7 is primarily the Mississippi and the Missouri rivers, as some of you are probably either experiencing or very well aware of. And then the storms, tornadoes, are winter storms. And a lot of folks don't realize Missouri is in the New Madrid seismic zone. We have that that we always prepare for and are ready for. Here's kind of how the presidential declaration process works. Essentially, you have an incident, and then in the middle, you get a lot of involvement from the state and FEMA. As I mentioned before, you have a joint preliminary damage assessment, the PDA. The state requests that. A team forms up. Joe's working one right now for the state of Kansas. The governor, based on that PDA, determines whether he or she's got enough in the way of damages to go ahead and go to the president and ask for a presidential declaration. Once the governor decides that, they send that up to the local region office here in Kansas City. The region puts its recommendation along with the governor's request, and then it goes to the president's office. This can happen as soon as within 2 hours of it being submitted, or on a norm, it's probably a week to 2 weeks, depending on the declaration. If it's a CNN event, catastrophic, you're going to see it within 2 hours. If it's not, you're probably going to see about a week to 2 week time frame that the declaration gets signed. Here's some of the criteria we use to determine whether a state gets a presidential declaration or not. You look at, again, some of these are a pretty blinding flash of the obvious. It's the impact and magnitude to the community, the number of disasters that state or that, in particular, that area has had within the last year or two. And one big thing here, and this is for PA only, there's a threshold, a dollar threshold based on the census and a formula, and I'm not all up to speed on the cosmic way that formula is set up, but essentially it's $1.30 per capita, and if you look at the Kansas population based on the census numbers that we use, the state has to come up with about $3.4 million worth of damage for PA to be a public assistance disaster. Here in Douglas County, you've got to come up with $326,000 worth of damage to be an eligible county to fall within that presidential declaration. Now, this amount will still be used. Say, for example, you don't make the 326, but you come up with $280,000 worth of damage. That total amount will still be used to determine whether the state gets a disaster or not, but you fall below the threshold of 320 or 326,000, you as a county will not be under that eligibility. So you can imagine, anyone here live in Johnson County? How many times has Johnson County received a presidential disaster declaration?
As far as I know, never.
Exactly. Because you got to look at the population there and the monetary flow. It never makes the cut. Last year when we had our office in Topeka, the governor came through and we had a map of Kansas, and I think in the last 6 or 7 years we had all the counties highlighted that had a disaster, all of them except Johnson, and he knew right off the bat. I know why. So this is that formula, and that kind of leads to why a disaster is very seldom declared in Johnson County. Is that Joe? I can't recall.
Yes, both of those per capita numbers are across the nation, and they change on a yearly basis. And the census data that's on there right now is the 2000 census. I think we've just got approval for starting July 1st to use the 2010 census data.
It's all based on the CPI for the per capita threshold that we're using. The PDA process, PDA inspections, here's what they're going to consist of. And Joe, I'll let you go ahead and chime in a little bit on this because you're actually doing it right now.
Well, the inspections, what we're doing right now in Kansas is we've got 6. We've got 6 teams out throughout the state of Kansas in different counties that have, from the county that Redding's in, all the way out to counties that are out west. I think they had some straight line winds that came across the western counties from the Colorado border and took out a lot of utility type stuff. There's also some counties up in the central northern part that, with all these different storm systems that went through, I just got off a phone call on the way over here that over the course of maybe 10 days they had, I think they were mentioning up to 20 or so inches of rain, that some of the roads are just destroyed. So we'll get teams that we'll put together based on different expertise. For instance, the electrical REC utilities, it's almost a kind of a thing all of it in its own. It can be a pretty complicated process, and you have to have qualified people that go look at that stuff. They'll go out, they'll sit down, say, with an applicant like the University of Iowa, and they'll go through these different categories. Emergency work, what type of preventative measures did you take? What did you do to protect the health and safety of the university staff and the students that are here? And we'll look at that. We'll look at debris if it was a debris event. We'll touch on environmental historical issues just so we know what maybe is coming, but we don't use that in determining preliminary damage assessment numbers. And we'll look at, like in your case here, public facility damage utilities. And we'll total that all up. We won't look at everything. If you get a declaration, that's when the big teams come in and they go out and they spend the weeks and the months, depending on the severity of it, to look at sites and take their measurements. We'll ask for what you have. You as an applicant would know, say here at the university, how many buildings, say, got damaged by a tornado, but we may not look at all of them. We'll say you had 10 buildings that got damaged. We'll say let's do a 10% sample of those and let's look at one. You give us estimates on the other ones. We just want to inspect one for the PDA standpoint of it. We'll total up those numbers. We put them into a spreadsheet, and then we figure it all out based on that per capita stuff, and then we move forward. If the state meets their state threshold, we recommend a declaration. If the county meets their county threshold, we recommend that they be designated. One thing I've always been corrected on is states get declared, counties get designated. So, anything else?
No. Appreciate it. Public assistance. What is public assistance all about? What is it all about? Essentially, I mentioned earlier, I think I said it's based, by you being a state university, you are an eligible applicant if this county is designated. And also certain nonprofits fall within that criteria. within and we're talking facilities, as Joe mentioned, if it's declared, we'll help with the emergency protective measures, debris removal, and the bottom line here is the repair or restoration of damaged public facilities. And that's very big. As beautiful and as wide as your campus is, that could definitely have a bearing. I'm going to relate and give you some examples. I've dealt with 2 universities, and they'll be nameless. I will say one university has done very well. The other university is still struggling, and it's been 2 years after the disaster. So we'll talk a little bit about that, and what you, as the University of Kansas, can do to posture yourselves to hopefully be that university that, hey, has got everything in line. And you're very fortunate. You got John here. He knows the conduits to reach out to FEMA, the state, and where to work and get things done. It's definitely a benefit to you all to have that working for you. As I mentioned before, it's got to be declared by the president. And once the president makes a declaration, there is a FEMA state agreement. That is the contract that the state signs up to as far as what FEMA will cover, what the state will cover, and when is the eligibility period, or the incident period as we call it. For example, right now, I think Kansas hasn't closed out their incident period since Reading occurred. I think they've got it from whatever that date was to ongoing. So that's the target of opportunity as we speak right now. But as soon as a declaration is made or it's been worked out, that incident period will be pretty much shut down, and only those items that happened within that incident period will be qualified for or be eligible for disaster support. This is kind of a busy slide. The thing where the university gets involved with is from this portion all the way down here. And I'll talk a little about, we've talked a little bit about the governor making the request, the declaration. The JFO is a joint field office. That's where I come in and Joe come in. Whenever a disaster is declared, we set up a joint field office. We don't operate out of the region. Sometimes we can. I'm actually doing a virtual operation, as we call it now, since I only have 6 counties in Iowa, that I can run a lot of that out of the regional office and still go to the respective state and do what I need to. Here in Kansas, if we had 40 or 50 some counties declared, we would probably set up a field office in close proximity, that it would be equal distance for our folks to go out and put the eyes and hands on to the respective applicants to work the mission. And we're going to talk a little bit about each of these particular steps in the process. The biggest one being the applicant's briefing, and I'll go into more detail about that. The applicant's briefing is, and John, do you usually represent the university for that, or is it Public Works, or? You've never done that. Okay, well, that'll be a good point. Has anyone here been to an applicant's brief? Okay, good. Well, we'll follow up with that then. Applicant brief. Applicant brief. Once a declaration has been made on a federal disaster, and say Douglas County is a designee, the state will put out a public notice, and they usually put it out through the emergency management chain within the state, through the county, the city, whatever municipality it is, saying, you know, it's such and such a day at the city library, we're going to have an applicant's briefing. And what that means is anyone that thinks they have eligible damage, or even if you don't know, show up to that meeting. We'll make the determination whether it's eligible or not, but that's a very critical meeting to be at. You go to that meeting, and it's hosted by the state. The state will give you their briefing and criteria that they need, or the information that they need from all of you. And FEMA will also discuss about some items about participation, if you any type of insurance you might have available. EHP is the Environmental Historical Preservation. EHP, anyone here work with environmental historical? Very key step. Do not, I'll repeat, do not destroy a building or remove debris or anything like that unless you get EHP consensus. We had a county here in Kansas, and it was, I think it was during the winter storms, I can't recall, but there was a bridge that pretty well got wiped out. Well, the county decided that they wanted to go ahead, well, it's not any use, so they removed the entire bridge. Once you do that, and it was a historical bridge, it was on the registrar or register and everything like that. Once you do that, and without having an environmental expert see that, you're no longer eligible for financial assistance from the federal government, because we have to get EHP to come in and say, hey, we've looked at it, it's been completely destroyed, we've resolve the issue, or we'll do a memo of understanding or agreement to, preserve or do whatever made it historical. They'll give us certain guidance, but if you don't follow that, you could lose all financial aid, right, Joe?
Yeah, one thing to reiterate, that the thing to keep in mind, anything that's 50 years old or older, that's one of the check marks to see that we start to look, or we start to get environmental involved. There are cases we try to be as helpful as possible. If something gets destroyed or something happens and maybe the procedures weren't followed to the best of their ability, we got some great environmental folks, and they'll do the best that they can to try to work with the applicant. But there are many cases where, because there's a violation of federal law or something like that, that funding is put in jeopardy. In some cases, funding is lost just because some of the proper federal laws that need to be followed weren't followed. If it's 50 years or older, then they'll start looking. It doesn't have to be 50 years old. There could be, you could have a building that was built in the last 10 years, let's say, that is by a prominent world-renowned architect that is significant based on that. And from an environmental, historical standpoint, they may look at that just based on the true unique nature of that particular individual or the concept behind how it was built. So
I was in a particular state, and you wouldn't think a parking garage would fall under the historical criteria. However, this parking garage had one of these things that went like this, like a spiral type thing. It fell within the historical criteria, and it was also on what they call automotive row. I guess the road that was associated by the parking garage was historical in whatever. So if ever in doubt, get your environmental historical folks involved. The state of Kansas has what they call a SHPO, the State Historical Preservation Officer. Use them, because that's who we're going to go to. And they're the ones that are either going to help mitigate or do whatever we need to get the project rolling. But yeah, if anything with a historical tie to it, always lean in that direction and get the experts involved. Anyone here involved with any federal procurement? Well, being a federal government, things can get complicated. So if you are involved in any type of federal procurement, as far as maybe you had some debris removed and you're wanting to claim the cost of that debris removal, you've got to make sure that whoever removed your debris, that you followed federal procurement guidelines, because if you didn't, you may not get funded for that. So just be aware of that. Get your general counsel involved with that, and any of your financial folks involved with that, because I'm sure they're very familiar with the federal process. If not, link them up with either the state, or the state can contact us, and we'll make sure we'll get you the right guidelines for that. But that can definitely be a showstopper if you don't follow federal procurement standards. At the applicant brief, we'll also talk about mitigation. Mitigation, I talked earlier about the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, where a certain money is set aside for all the counties of the state to kind of chime in on. This particular mitigation is for your particular structure or building. An example would be, and I'm not a technical public works guy, so Joe, you can help me. I know we got these things called alligator clips. Is that what they're called, to hold roofs on?
I think, let's go simpler though.
Okay.
Say windows. Well, let's use we're not going to get a hurricane here, but hurricane's always a big thing along the coast and stuff like that. And if a building windows get blown out, it probably could work for a tornado too, based on winds or straight line winds. If you have wind damage that breaks windows, then a 406 hazard mitigation measure may be to use a stronger impact window to mitigate against a like event in the future. Mitigation can't stop everything. Sometimes it's said that we're going to mitigate this and it won't happen again. I don't think there's anything that we can ever prevent, but we'll try to do our best using federal dollars in a proper way to minimize the impacts in the future in a like type event, so in hopes that we won't have to come back and spend federal dollars there again. Not that we wouldn't want to, it's just thinking being prudent with the taxpayer dollars.
Yeah. During the applicant brief, like I said, you'll get a basic 101 mitigation presentation for you, any eligible applicant that shows up. And with the information that they're going to share with you, the onus is still on you whether you want to accept it or not, except it will be an eligible cost that will be covered if we can mitigate that facility. And there is, I think there's some procedures or guidelines trying to be developed that, you know, if you are offered mitigation in the future and you turn it down, if you have a subsequent disaster, you may not get federal funding to the degree that you might expect. So I think more on that to follow. That's still being worked out. But mitigation is a big thing for all of us. And for all of you, like I said, hopefully it'll prevent a follow-on occurrence with that particular item. Yes.
You'll want to, let's say from an asbestos thing, you're going to want to follow the proper guidelines for asbestos removal. And if you, depending on the severity of the event and whether we're here yet or not, one of the main things to always keep in mind is no matter what you do, in general you will do it the way you would normally do it. Take federal procurement for instance, 44 CFR Part 13 defines the contracting procurement type procedures and stuff like that, and they'll give some basic guidelines. A lot of applicants in a lot of states actually have tougher procurement procedures than the federal government does. As long as they're at least at the federal government level or stronger, then you're good. The nature of disasters, you're talking about asbestos. I think 9/11, that was a major disaster, and there was asbestos that was everywhere. They did their best to clean up to the best of their ability. Under emergency response type activities, some of those regulations aren't quite as strong because you're still trying to save life and protect property and things like that. So it wouldn't be the same as, it wouldn't necessarily be the same as if you wanted to go in and remodel that building. If it's been blown apart and it's all over the place, you're going to do your best to try to contain the stuff as you can, but there's no way that you're going to be able to wrap a plastic bubble around a whole disaster area to try to contain asbestos fibers and things like that. It's just not possible.
But what Joe is saying there, in your case, just make sure you've captured it very well. Because what happens is, say for example, we as an entity, FEMA comes back and denies you something like that, you have the right to appeal it, and it's that type of information. It was life-saving, you did this, you did this, you did this, and if not, you would have suffered this, the consequences. And that's an appealable event. So, Joe's right, there are certain considerations in that, but the bottom line with anything to do with public assistance, the more you document, the more you take pictures, the more you have a historical chronology of what occurred, it's going to be to your benefit. And then, as I mentioned, the applicant's brief, anybody that, again, since you've never been involved with one, you could bring everyone associated, but it'll be up to the state. The state will ask, what do you have there? I've seen some applicant briefs where there have been maybe one person there. I've seen another one where they've had to bring chairs in because everyone showed up. But some of the folks you're looking for is the facilities affected, whether it be the management, public works, funds control type folks, folks that have a working knowledge of that facility. So if there's certain questions of eligibility or something like that come up, you can help answer that. But as large as this university is, and again, I don't know if that would be on Public Works or whoever, that may be something you may have to work out in your plans when you have a disaster hit. Who represents the university at the applicant brief? And with that being said, the initial applicant brief, you can, as long as the university is represented, that's the main thing. You can then go get all the other sub folks within your organization and say, hey, I just had a meeting with the state, here's what they're looking for, and you can also capture in that respect, the collective efforts of all by one individual attending. You've seen that happen, haven't you, Joe?
Yeah, you'll get more opportunities. Mike will talk about it a little bit, I think coming up here in a few slides. Yeah, the next slide actually, where the applicant briefing just starts it off, and then the kickoff meeting is where if you will, the kind of the rubber hits the road. Yeah,
the applicant brief is, like I said, the state hosts that. Once that is completed, we then will schedule a kickoff meeting. The kickoff meeting is FEMA hosted. FEMA sponsors this, and an RPA is a request for public assistance. Once you go to that applicant brief and you determine, hey, I'm an eligible applicant, it happened in my county during this time frame, and we have all these facilities, you can then put in an official request for public assistance. And it's that point where you're going to have a FEMA project specialist assigned to you. And so you're not alone in this process. At that point, the FEMA project specialist will work with you along with a state counterpart to ensure that they're capturing everything that you have eligible, and we're trying to help you as best we can, because we know during time of disaster we want that recovery to be facilitated as much as possible. We're going to work with you, and I'll show you some of the organizational structure with that, but you will have someone assigned with you. It won't be in a vacuum. You'll find also there'll be certain documents that you need to bring. The state will let you know that, and I mentioned before, the state of Kansas is very good at this process. They'll determine your eligibility, what damages, and any special considerations. They'll also go over timelines. The applicant brief and the kickoff meeting starts the clock. And there are some timelines, and we'll cover that in a later slide too, that those timelines are pretty rigid. However, there are waivers to those, and we can work those. But the big thing is, as soon as you know that you are eligible and can make these meetings, we encourage that, because unfortunately we've had numerous disasters here, like I said, in the last couple of years. A couple of applicants, hey, I didn't know I could do this, and they were well beyond the timeline. They had received the notice, however, it just slipped their mind, and they failed to show up, and unfortunately we couldn't do anything for them. So just remember that. Public assistance eligibility. We've got a kind of a pyramid way that we determine eligibility. First thing we look at is the applicant. Right off the bat, if the applicant is eligible, then we'll start going into the other eligibility criteria. And in your case, like I said, if this county is declared for public assistance by virtue of being a state university, you are automatically an eligible applicant. Am I wrong in that, Joe? So you're automatically eligible. The next thing we're going to look at is the facility. And there's some criteria for facility. For example, if you had a vacant facility on campus and it wasn't used for anything other than it's been boarded up, whatever, it's not an eligible facility. It's got to be something that you are currently actively using. So we will look at it from a facility standpoint. Is it an eligible facility? Then once the facility and the applicant are eligible, then we look at what work are you asking for? What are you asking to be done? Does it fall within the purview of the incident period, the disaster, and is it covered work that we normally will provide in this case? If all these three meet the eligibility criteria, then we go to cost. And by cost, we look at comparable cost factors. And Joe, I'll let you go into a little bit more with that.
There's anybody familiar with RS means? It's a national estimating tool. Take again for buildings. You guys have a lot of buildings. If a building gets damaged, we use a thing they call CEF, cost estimating format, which would be one of the big tools we'll use is RS means, because it's a national accepted estimating tool. And we'll compare, we will do the estimate or help you do the estimate based on those costs, or if you already have a cost in place from a contractor that you've awarded a bid to, we might use that tool to validate the reasonableness of that cost. As long as we can determine reasonable costs, then we're good. If there's something very unique about your costs, all you have to do is kind of explain it, spell it out, and say the reason that these costs seem to be higher than what somebody might consider to be normal is because of this. If it's justifiable, we're not going to fight with you and say, no, RS means says it should be this. We try our best to be flexible and be reasonable and work as well as we can in a team approach to determine what the best possible reimbursement program, if you will, that we can do in a particular project.
Thanks. This is a team of folks that will actually be out in the field working, and you're going to be with actually the project specialists here. There'll be an assigned project specialist specifically for you, the university, and your respective facilities. So you will have someone working hand in hand with you. More than likely, they'll probably be assigned in this neck of the woods to cover a locality. The PAC crew leader, the public assistance crew leader, is somebody that will ensure that you're getting the customer service that you need. They have several project specialists under them, and that's the conduit for you if you have issues or complaints to work through that PAC crew leader. Along with that, you're going to have a state counterpart. And this just gives you an idea. Whenever we set up a joint field office, we have all these various types of specialties, Joe, when he usually deploys out with me, he's this guy right here and oversees the entire PA program. But we will have various teams going throughout the state working with various entities. If there's unique requirements, like for example, what Joe mentioned, the rural electrical co-op type folks, we'll have a whole team of electrical folks go work the electrical issues. If it's any type of utilities, we might have those folks working that. If it happens to be debris removal, we'll have special folks working debris. We'll have folks that are hopefully an expert within that realm to take care of the task at hand. We also will incorporate mitigation and environmental historical folks. They will be part of that team that goes out in the field and provide that expertise. Joe, anything more from the organization? Are we good? Okay. Here's the responsibilities. You all fall within this category right here. You are the sub-grantee. And you'll hear that a lot, sub-grantee, because the state is actually the grantee. That is, whenever there's grants or money involved, we give the money to the state. The state then gives it out to all of you. So they are the grantee, and they'll work your particular requirement. And here you can see, here's what you need to be responsible for. This just kind of gives you a snapshot view of what we as FEMA will handle, what the state then handles. But the big thing here is that documentation. You know, in a time of a disaster or crisis, I know there's a lot of things going on, but you know, help for that cost factor to help, you know, to get you back to that pre-disaster condition. We need everything you have in that particular case. Sure.
Actually, I was thinking this may be a good opportunity. And is anybody familiar with ICS forms? You know some of the forms in there. The fire departments use them a lot, where they'll talk about what type of equipment is being used and who's using it and how many hours they used it. There's some basics of those forms that, from some of the things I've experienced over the years, I've been doing FEMA-related work since about 2000, disaster work since about 2002, and the last 6 years of my life I've spent all but about 2 months each year on the road. I would make it home about 2 months out of the year. So I've seen a lot of applicants, a lot of paperwork and such. And one of the things that continues through my mind is if it was possible in some kind of an educational program way to help applicants within counties and states and things to understand proper documentation tracking, that if, let's say, you all in your daily routines got in a habit of putting things in a certain order and it just became a routine thing, when we rolled into town, it would probably be as simple as handing us some of those ICS type documents, handing those things to us. It would have everything we needed. If you have digital cameras and GPS units, and as you were doing things, you knew something happened to your campus, and you took pictures of some of the damage, and you took GPS readings at some of those locations, and you kept those in order. When a project specialist was assigned to you and came in, the process could be as simple as they got to look at it. They're going to want to go out and look at the actual damage or sampling of it, and take that information, formulate it into a grant, the project worksheet, and process it. And if everything is in order and there are no real significant issues or big environmental type things, there are some major dollar projects that we've actually processed in a matter of days. From the moment that they got to write them in that, but from the moment that they came into the JFO and got entered into the system through our data entry thing, and they went through all the review queues that could be up to almost 12. There could be 12 different entities that have to review these projects for eligibility criteria. That process, depending on the completeness of that package, can take hours to a couple of days to, there are some cases with some of what even Mike's experienced with some other locations that the stuff wasn't in order as well as it could be, months and years. And we certainly don't want you to fall into a situation where it would take years or even months for a project to go through the process. So the documentation is truly a key in how it's formulated, how it's put together.
Allowable cost. I know this is probably near and dear to a lot of you on what's allowed out there. In addition to the actual project itself, a lot of folks don't realize there are direct and indirect administrative costs you can claim for reimbursement. That is, for example, attending the applicant brief, the kickoff briefs. That takes time away from your primary job. If you're so selected to do that type of thing, you can claim the tasks associated with it within reason for additional costs to be reimbursed. And so you need to keep those things in mind. And Joe's, when you all get ready to leave here, he's got a public assistance, I think it's the guide. Is that what you're going to hand out to him?
I've got an applicant's handbook and then also a public assistance digest that gives, the public assistance digest is a one-pager on key topics, and it gives you a brief outline of that particular topic. And then at the bottom of the page, if there are like Stafford Act references, 44 CFR references, policies, it tells you where all the different things that equate to that. And the applicant handbook is clear that it's geared for an applicant and helps them through the process. It's been a long time coming for that. That applicant handbook has just been published, I think, in March of 2010. So it's a little over a year old. And the other one was pretty old, so this is all up to date and nice. And then the public assistance policy digest. I've got 25 that I brought with you, so I'm not sure how many people are here. I didn't count, but hopefully we have enough. And then Mike at the end will show, and we can talk about that. All of this stuff and more is available electronically over the web.
Website. But the big thing here is, a lot of folks just focus on the project itself, the damaged facility, the repairs, the reconstruction, that type of thing. There's all those, direct and indirect costs. For example, say for example, you have an inspector that comes out and checks the facility. You need to break away and help with that inspection. You can prorate those costs associated with that type of thing for reimbursement. So you need to be and the prep of cost estimates. When you prepare all this stuff, you may need to bring an individual aboard or whatever. You can go ahead and try to file for that for additional costs back to you or additional savings back to you. Yep. Exactly on track. You're exactly right. That's where we get into a lot of the tug of war, because someone will say, well, we expended an additional 45 hours for this. Okay, well, who, when, where, what, all that kind of. If you've got it well documented, that's an easy kill for us to go ahead and process it through.
I'll make one clarification. On the indirect administrative cost, the grantee, unless they choose what they call pass-through funds, the grantee is allotted, it's a percentage of the total disaster dollars that are given for indirect administrative costs for them to administer the grant. Most states, because of obvious financial reasons, don't do any pass-through funds. So typically, and I don't know if Kansas has done it, I don't think they have, the last I've known, have not done pass-through funds. So as an applicant, you wouldn't get indirect administrative costs.
You could get the direct.
But you get the direct, and that's where the key would be keeping track of each project that you're working on, who it was, from somebody that has, from an administrative level or admin level where somebody's doing filing and keeping paperwork. If all of that is kept track of, imagine the university your size, you have a great accounting system and you have all different codes in your different accounting codes. If there were codes that were assigned when you knew an event happened, even before it got declared, and you say this is a major event, we want to track certain aspects of that by codes. When we rolled into town, you sorted by those codes, you would probably have most of the information that we would need available through your accounting system just by sorting and printing those documents.
But the main cost, administrative cost, would be personnel.
Right.
So it would be probably through a payroll system or
Yeah,
something.
and you have coding systems in your payroll, right? Are there payroll codes depending on what you're doing? So if you set up some payroll code that dealt with disaster type activities or something of a significant event, and you kept track of that through that coding system, it may be easy for you to sort something that was outside of your normal doing business, maintaining the university, as this was a tornado went through here, may not get declared, but again, that habit, if you got in the habit of an unusual event and you tracked it by a certain code, in the event that a declaration did occur, you would be ahead of the game. You wouldn't have to go back through your files or through your accounting system and try to figure out who worked on what. And yes, that works as well. if you say the preventative nature, if you know, say you use that as an incident, you know some of the struggles you went through and how you had to gather that information. If there is a way, I'm not, just a suggestion thing, if you all attempted to try to do something where you put something together to where that process would become easier for you, then the grant writing process becomes even easier. And some of those frustrations that you may have went through gathering all that information, trying to sort it, and trying to meet the requirements of the things that we're asking, you may be ahead of the game by setting up certain codes and things. Emergency work, I don't know, we didn't mention that. Emergency work, you went through that whole thing that's overtime only. Category A and B type stuff is only overtime only, and then all your permanent type work is all your time. So that adds some interesting twist to keeping track of your time as well. And salaried employees, if they get paid straight time, or they get paid salary no matter how many hours they work, then there's struggles there as well, because even if they worked overtime, they didn't get paid for it. So the hours would count, and any equipment they use would count, but the pay, there would be no reimbursement for pay. So there's all these interesting nuances that take place within a federal government grant system that sometimes can be frustrating, but we try to make it as easy as possible.
Snow removal is a whole different animal, but snow removal, we would only reimburse if it was associated with, and I'm giving this in a really big picture, there's a lot more specifics to it, but if say an ambulance or a law enforcement had to respond to a snow incident and it was life-saving or life-sustaining, it was reimbursable. And the only way, I think when that policy was implemented, the only way we could do that is go to each respective county and get their call-out logs. What, when, where, when these call-out, and sometimes we got reams of paperwork this thick. And we started, and Joe and his folks started working with some respective counties to put some kind of code, whether it was a code 512 or something like that. It was a run because someone was stranded in their vehicle on a snow-covered road. Well, that was easy to cover. There was a certain code associated with it. We didn't need to get the reams of paperwork and showing that, from so many miles the vehicle had to travel to get to wherever. We got, okay, here's what the cost associated with it was. Again, it creates some additional work up front for whatever entity's doing that, but in the long run, if you have a disaster or something like that, if you've got something like that in play or something that's tailorable, it may save you a lot of headache later. Just, again, we're not mandating that, but it just seems to be easier for a lot of communities that have developed something like that. Oh, let me get back to, on your specific project, say for example, your building's damaged, destroyed, or whatever. If the project amount is estimated to be at below $63,900, you're going to get the money, the whole pot of money, $63,900. We're going to give it to you to do whatever you need to do. Now, with that being said, say, for example, you get some cost efficiencies from whatever you're building or whatever, the eligible project. Whatever is left from that $63,900, you can then use it for any other eligible items that you might have with that facility that maybe wasn't covered for originally. And it's a little tricky with that. You'll need the help of the state person and the federal person, but again, when you have a small project, you do have some leeway with that dollar amount. However, and this large project should actually say equal or greater than $63,900, you will only get paid as certain phases of that project is completed. You will not, say you have a $70 million facility that you're building or constructing by virtue of the disaster. You will not get all $70 million up front. You'll get as it's phased throughout the project. Joe, anything on that?
Yeah, the small project is typically it's based on estimates. That whole process we were talking about, reviews, when it goes through the review process and it gets what we call obligated or awarded, that money, then there's a process goes through where they transfer from the U.S. Treasury into some fund that the state can draw down on. As soon as the state wants to, they can give that all to you in chunks. And then the large projects, depending on the state, they may say you've got to produce a certain number of invoices of work that you've done, and then we'll pay you for them. Or some states may say you produce a certain number of invoices of work that you've done, and also that work you're going to do within the next 60 days, and they'll pay you for it. And then in chunks. Some of them may do it in quarter, 25% increments. It's all a function of how the grantee is set up and how they want to distribute the large project funds. One thing to keep in mind on large projects is at the end of the project, when you're done with the whole thing, I don't think you mentioned it, closeouts, right? No. Closeout things is there's a closeout process on large projects that basically you get reimbursed for all intended purposes for the exact penny that you spent on that project. If it went over and it was all eligible, you'll get additional money. If it was less than what was originally estimated, then if they've already, for some reason you've already gotten the money, they'll ask for some money back. But it's an actual expenditure on the large projects. It's an estimate on the small. All these policies we have is specifically spelled out. I'm not sure offhand. There's so many. You'll see if you go looking. There's probably, I printed out one time, there's documentation like that of all the different policies and procedures that fall within the PA program and different ones for specific things, excuse me. There are certain requirements. That money, whatever that leftover money from the small project, can't just be spent on anything you want. There are certain procedures that have to be followed and certain things they have to be spent on. Off the top of my head, I wouldn't be able to answer that question and tell you that, but it's outlined within policy and things of how it has to be spent.
And that would be a great venue for, like I said, to sit down with your project specialist and your state counterpart and say, okay, here's what I've done. Am I legal to do this? And they'll help work you through that process. Cost share. A lot of folks don't realize the standard cost share, when we come in and we give a grant or award a grant, it's 75% of the total project. The state then chips in the other 25%. And in Kansas here, Kansas, of that 25%, they'll give you 10% and they rely on you to pay the other 15%. So keep that in mind, especially a university this size. You got $500 million worth of damages or costs that you're trying to recoup. That could be a big chunk. Keep that in mind because there are some entities that forget about the cost share. They see that big dollar grant award and they think, oh, hey, that's great. Well, there is something that you have to cover too. Some things to consider for grant considerations. The whole focus of our program is to return you to the pre-disaster condition. If you were whole before that, we'll make you whole before or after that. If you weren't whole, you're going to get whatever condition you were at prior to that disaster. Some things we will cover or work, codes and standards. If your facility, for some reason, wasn't up to the current codes or standards, we will cover that within the grant to ensure that it's up to the current codes and standards. That cost will be covered. Alternate projects. Say, for example, you've got a facility. You've been using it. It was an eligible facility, but due to technology or whatever, you feel as a university that you're not going to use that facility anymore. You'll get awarded whatever it was going to be to repair or replace that facility. You can then petition to do an alternate project instead of repairing or replacing that facility as it was used before. Joe, do you have any good examples of that?
Well, I don't know if. Well, let's keep it simple. Let's say there's a road on your campus and there's a bridge there that nobody travels anymore. Maybe people will walk along there, but it really doesn't serve the campus well to continue to run traffic over there. Your average daily traffic is 1 car a day or something like that. So that bridge, it was in use, it was maintained, and it got wiped out in a flood. And let's just say hypothetically that it cost $500,000 to replace that bridge. And you decide as a campus, that's not the best use of that dollar. So we're going to do an alternate project and we're going to do something else. We need new public works vehicles, new plows to plow our campus roads, or we want to do some improvements to the pavement or something like that. The alternate project, you get 90% of the federal share. So there is a reduction with an alternate project. And you take the money, there's, again, in the policies and stuff, there's certain requirements that you have to meet, that you have to do that. and you got to fall within there. And you have to request. The one thing to keep in mind on an alternate project is we'll write the project up for the bridge initially. You will submit a request to the state and say, I don't want to fix that bridge, I want to do an alternate project. Then the state formulates a letter and they put the official request into FEMA, and then we go through the process of writing up what that alternate project that you want is, and then going through the approval process there. Again, there's all those different reviews. There could be environmental reviews that may be needed depending on what you're doing and things of that nature. One caveat I want to add to the codes and standards. Just as a general rule of thumb, the codes and standards that would be upgraded, that we would cover, would be things that you implement no matter what. I mean, that you went to this code and standard, and in every situation that would pertain to that, you use that code and standard. It can't be we're going to decide to use this particular code or standard in this particular project, but we don't want to use it on that project. If you don't use it across the board, then we would not necessarily cover it. And architectural electrical codes and standards are a perfect example. They're nationally recognized. They're put in place. A lot of counties and states, they implement certain standards that have to be applied. That's a good example of something that goes across the board. You have to follow it, and that we would, like a handicap access. Maybe one of your buildings doesn't have handicap access, and now with the replacement or the repair of that, it was a significant enough damage by federal law and by state and even maybe local law. It says you got to have that. We will assist in funding the additional costs to provide that.
You can also do an improved project. What an improved project is, say for example you have a fire department on the campus and you have a 2-bay garage or a 2-bay facility in that fire department, and you want to have a 3rd bay by virtue of EMT or something like that. You can build a 3-bay fire department, but we're only going to pay up to that 2-bay requirement. That 3rd bay is on you, but you're getting that economies of that new facility and what have you. So if you think ahead in that respect, you can get an improved project and work again through your specialist, but that's just an example of something you can do in that type of situation. Repair versus restoration. Depending on the facility, if we have what we call a 50% rule. If the repair is going to cost 50% or more of what the actual value of that facility, you can get a whole new facility, is what we're looking at. And we'll apply a benefit cost analysis on it, and if it exceeds that 50% rule, then you're looking at a new facility. So something else to keep in mind when you go through the grant considerations. Insurance, we're always, the insurance is always going to be deducted, so keep that in mind. A lot of folks think that just because FEMA's here, we're not going to consider insurance. We are going to consider insurance. That will have a key play. And I can't stress that enough again. Remember what EHP is? Environmental Historical Preservation. It will come back to haunt you. Okay, hazard mitigation grants. We talked about that, and I already gave you an example of the safe rooms. A certain percentage of the federal dollars expended for that particular disaster are given back to the state to do hazard mitigation throughout the entire state. And again, an example of that, and John even highlighted that, is these safe rooms. Okay, here's some of the university lessons learned that I had, university public assistance lessons learned. Working with several universities. I think I started off the presentation by saying there was one university that's doing really well, that opened their doors on time. Another university, they're still struggling. And again, they'll be nameless, but the key consideration to keep in mind is when you have a major disaster, the state is the applicant grantee. You as a university are the sub-grantee, and don't lose sight of that. If you try to end around the state and go straight to FEMA, whatever, you're going to create some hurdles, and it could create putting a longer duration on what you need to get accomplished. So just remember that. Yes, it may be, unfortunately, say a tornado, the only spot it hit here is the university. Well, the university is going to be our primary focus of where we're going to be providing all of our efforts. But again, the state is still the grantee or the applicant. They're the one that signs the contract, the FEMA state agreement, and that's who we have to work through. So just don't lose sight of that. In a university environment, you get a lot of smart people around the table. And I talked a little bit about the improved projects, the possibility of repair versus reconstruction. you can get a lot of what-ifing around the table. And just watch that. If your university is saying, hey, first part of September, we're going to open our doors to all the students, and that's what your goal is, remember, keep those timelines and all those considerations geared towards that. Otherwise, it could be December before you even, if the weather permits, to even dig up the dirt to even start construction, because you tried to what if, well, if I tried to go and improved here, modified here, this or that. Focus on what you need to do. Cost share, I talked a little bit about that. Remember, there is a cost share associated, so especially with a university this size, and if you had, heaven forbid, the damage or destruction that might occur, there is going to be a substantial cost share to this. Do you all use contractors a lot if you were in a situation like this? Okay. When you use contractors, keep engaged. Sometimes particular universities will pick a contractor, hands off, and they'll let the contractor go run everything. Well, you are still the sub-applicant or the sub-grantee that we're going to work through, and we're here to make sure that your needs are met, but sometimes that contractor may be a roadblock to what needs to be to get accomplished. So if you're the overseer, the quality analysis or QA/QC type individual with that, make sure you keep engaged with the contracting process. We've had numerous problems with access to damage. We have to put eyes on sometimes to make sure that our project worksheets are the way that you want them to come across, and we need to go see the damage. Unfortunately, sometimes the contractor will not allow us that access. Well, if they don't allow us that access, that just keeps shifting it down the road, and it's going to take time, and I'm sure sooner or later your Board of Regents are going to start thumping, when are you going to get this done? When are the doors going to open? Well, we have to work that. Make sure that we have that access that when we need it. DAC means direct administrative costs. Contractors, as you can imagine, and rightly so, they're going to declare or they're going to file for administrative costs. Make sure they're reasonable. Help us out. For example, we had an individual, and I think it had to do with the one particular university, and it had to do with porta potties. And I think they were charging $400 an hour in administrative costs to do something with the porta potties. And I can't remember what it was, when the standard rate was, I don't know, Joe, if you know, it was like $75 or something like that. So that was not a fair direct administrative cost, and we denied it. So even though you have a contractor out there, keep engaged in the process. Temporary facilities. With a lot of academic environments, you've got to get classes going, you've got to get the labs up and running and all that kind of stuff. You may not have the facility, so you may have a temporary facility established. Or you may bring in, whether it's a modular or you name it, you may have a temporary facility. That's great, and that it will normally be covered under us with the grant process. However, be aware there are some universities or educational environments that want to keep that temporary facility after you build the permanent structure. If you keep that temporary facility, there's a salvage cost associated with it, which means the dollar amounts will be less in some degree. So just keep that in mind. That, and as you read the guidebook that Joe put out, you'll get a further understanding of that. But temporary facilities, a lot of entities will use the temporary facilities just so they can get the doors open, get the resiliency back into the community, that type of thing. Joe, you have anything you want to add on that? Okay. And the bottom line again is don't disengage. Be part of the process. Anyone here from the science department or any other technical area? There's certain unique one-of-a-kind equipment items that you may have built here at the university, versus off-the-shelf, whatever. You built it here by virtue of whatever project you're working on. Take pictures of it and keep costs of those things, because your equipment is covered. Your equipment is a covered item or a covered expense, and a lot of times when you have that one or unique piece of equipment, we're going to compare, as Joe said, compare some costs, but we can't find it anywhere. We may find something similar to it, whereas it might have been 4 or 5 times the amount what we thought that particular piece of equipment should have cost, because it provides a unique operation for you. So if you have those unique equipment items, try to keep track of those type of things. Keep the university board, or whether the Board of Regents or whoever is kind of governing the entire process, keep them informed, because a lot of times they'll either come to the state or us, and it's like that miscommunicate, and I know a lot of times, especially when it has to do with the operations of the university environment, they're very much focused on what's going on. So Keep them apprised of the whole process. EHP, I can't stress that enough, especially when it comes to student unions. Student unions seem to be, there's a lot of unique issues in EHP with a student union, especially when you got various food venues and other things that you're trying to be caught up with the current environment and not realizing, well, geez, I didn't consider EHP when that was done a year ago or 2 years ago, that type of thing. It takes time. With our process, as you can imagine, with any process, recovery is just going to, it's going to take a while. Greensburg is still going on. It's probably going to go on for years to come. And I would venture to say Joplin is going to be a long-term process. It's not going to happen in a year or two. University breaks. For the holiday breaks, the summer breaks, our folks, depending when the disaster occurred, they're going to work around the clock to make sure that you get what you need. And we had a situation when we were down in Wichita. It was over the Christmas holiday breaks. A couple universities down there where the entire staff was gone. It was the holiday period. We had no one to reach out to, and there's certain timelines that have to be met. And unfortunately, we couldn't get the right person aboard to give us the information we needed. And it may affect the granting of grants that we give out to you. And Stafford Act specialists. If you can have a Stafford Act is the governing laws, and we have a booklet on it, as far as what we can give and what we can provide in the way of a presidential disaster declaration. A lot of universities now are going to, whether it be they have risk mitigation folks or insurance type folks on their campus or whatever, they're starting to become Stafford Act specialists. So they can think ahead of the game to be smart, to be your liaison. Granted, we're going to provide you with all the expertise we can, but if you can take those preemptive strikes and have everything ready, that's even a plus to help towards that road to recovery and shorten that timeline. Here's some critical timelines. The request for public assistance, you got to make that request within 30 days of the declaration. And again, all these are kind of like building blocks. I didn't talk about appeals, but anytime we give you a bit of information, say for example, you want to do a certain improved project and we deny it, you can appeal almost all those type of instances. And by appealing, what you do is you go to the regional administrator and you provide that information. For example, there might be something we left out that we didn't cover, but you definitely want to cover that, and you can appeal it. Everything's appealable. Even though we may come out and say no the first time, don't take that as the definitive answer. Appeal it if you feel you got enough justification to go forward. But appeals must be within 60 days of the action notice. That action notice being, for example, we denied something, and we denied it on the 1st of June. 60 days within that date, you got to appeal it in order to make the system. Submitted work, it's got to be within 60 days of that kickoff meeting. Remember I talked about the kickoff and the applicant briefs. Just some critical timelines you've got to work. And alternate project requests, they got to be within a year of the kickoff. After it's all said and done, you're finally made a decision. That's the no later than date. And then this is just some stuff to keep on the back of your mind when we talk about debris clearance. Whenever you're working debris at a respective site, 6 months is the norm, but we can get extensions. We just need to get those worked in advance. These are just some marks on the wall that when you're working in this environment, just keep that in mind. And if you need to work an extension, work it as soon as possible, and hopefully work it before it's the day before the 6-month extension, because it may take a lot longer than you think. Permanent work here, that's everything said and done, a new facility or repairs to a said facility, that's the permanent work to get you back into that pre-disaster status. You need to keep the paperwork for about 3 years. That's when you're vulnerable for an audit. And believe me, if you have a disaster of such scope that it affects this entire university, you're going to have some kind of audit trail come down here. So you definitely need to keep everything for 3 years. That's your vulnerability period for an audit based on the grants that we give you. Here's the page that Joe was talking about earlier as far as additional resources. Title 44 CFR, that's actually the governing regulation. And this website here is actually a great website. And I know you got the note handouts, and I can provide you actually the full-scale slides here if you want them, so you can go back to them. But you can get a lot of the resources here. Again, we appreciate you spending the time here. I know it's an hour and a half. It's a great day outside, kind of hot in here, and having to bear through this. Hopefully, it's information you can take and use forward to be better prepared for hopefully that disaster that won't happen for you. But if it does, you've got some tools and resources to work with. That's pretty much in a nutshell what we have. Joe, anything else from your end before we open it up to any particular questions? Or okay. Any other questions or comments? Yes, sir. There are some nuances too, but yeah.
And you would be your own applicant. You know, the university would be an applicant. They assign what they call a FIPS number, which I think is moving towards the DUNS number.
You probably don't know what the DUNS number is.
Yeah,
it's just a federal identifier number.
I think the DUNS, it's Dun and Bradstreet. They have that assigned number. We're now, as an organization, moving in that direction to use those numbers. My understanding is a lot of the other federal grants out there, they require it. There was some law that went into effect that says we require it now too. And I guess it's really easy to get. But yeah, you would, as a PNP, the process is just a little bit more painful for a PNP than it is for a governmental entity. There's more hoops that have to be jumped through. There's more eligibility criteria that have to be looked at. There's more paperwork that has to be submitted, that has to be reviewed. Like, for instance, on the end of that, the RPA, the university would submit an RPA with the basic information. It's a single sheet thing. Because you're a state agency, it's fairly simple. For a PNP, especially if you hadn't been an eligible applicant in a past disaster, we're still going to require the stuff, but there's a certain amount of information that has to be put together, has to be submitted with the RPA. And then that goes through the approval process, and it may take a little bit longer than just a simple RPA from, say, the KU as an applicant.
But would they be considered a sub-grantee, just like KU would be?
Yes, they would be their own separate entity. You have to have that whole, if you will, some people call it the wedding cake, that eligibility. You have to be an eligible applicant. You have to have an eligible facility. Let's use an example. Let's say that you're a nonprofit working out of one of the university's facilities. Any damage to the facility would be theirs. But let's say you have equipment in there, or you have supplies or something of that nature that are yours. That would be your potential eligible facility or eligible work or stuff that you want to submit, and then we would go through the normal process. Anything else?
Well, thank you for your patience and staying with us today.